Our next speaker is Stephanie Dowrick. Now, Stephanie is a woman who I personally love to read. I enjoy reading her books and her articles. I feel challenged and inspired by her take on the bigger questions in life, and I think she has a really important voice to add to the discussion. So please welcome Stephanie Dowrick.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you also to Beth and her wonderful team at the Vajrayana Institute. Are you there at the front? I can begin to see you now. And thank you to you all for being here. It's such a joy. Some of you might recognize a really wonderful line that's come to us from the 14th century, from the time of Chaucer, although this is not from Chaucer. It's from the Sufi poet Hafiz. And it says, and perhaps this is shocking, "I am happy before I have a reason." Well, I hope this line is a little bit shocking, because in truth, as it rings in our 21st century ears, it could remind us that we too often need a reason to be happy, as though our default position was one of unhappiness or dissatisfaction. In that logic, life must prove itself to us repeatedly. Loved ones must win our affection repeatedly. The meaning of existence, or just reasons why we should like ourselves or appreciate our gift of life, must be worried at repeatedly. And to feel even halfway content, we may have to get our own way repeatedly. And even when we sometimes have so many fine reasons to be happy, with not too many obstacles in our way, we are nevertheless not entirely happy, not entirely well, and not unshakably at peace. A similarly outrageous teaching is credited to the historical Buddha, and it says, "If you knew how perfect everything is, you would throw back your head and laugh at the sky." It's possible, of course, that Hafiz and indeed the historical Buddha were deluded. Many people today would think so. After all, our attention is so easily caught by all that is going wrong, by all that fails to satisfy our hopes or thwarts our agenda, or that justifies our lack of kindness or our lack of peace. And yet we're not quite satisfied with that either, are we? Some of us very sincerely want to know more about happiness. We want to taste it, we want to feel it, we want to have more of it, and why not? Perhaps that's why you're here. We can't be a source of happiness for others until we know happiness intimately ourselves. Yet another poet, this time Roman Catholic priest and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, said, "Joy, joy. Joy is the unmistakable sign of the presence of God." And if God is a problem word for you, then recast what he said as, "Joy is the unmistakable sign of the spirit rising, of your Buddha nature leaping, of your soul stirring within this vast universe of which you are, every one of you, a unique and beautiful element." And then let me rush to add that these names, Hafiz, the Buddha, de Chardin, are just three among thousands of deeply loving spiritual teachers who have taught us that we can learn so much about life and spirit and love and even the faithfulness of God from happiness, at least as much as we can learn from suffering. And also that happiness, giving it, receiving it, belonging to life through it, that this unshakable appreciation and contentment is our birthright. Perhaps It is our true nature. Perhaps it is the nature of Buddha nature. And that often what we regard as such a looming obstacle to our happiness is simply a disappointment, a glitch, a passing frustration, where we have no need really to linger. In other words, and in different ways, many of the speakers here today have already and will continue to share a similar message, that is, whoever we are and whatever we believe, much of what we call happiness is in our own hands. It need not have a reason. It need not depend on events outside ourselves. It is not beyond our power to choose. Whatever happiness is, whatever contentment and a sense of deep commitment to life is, it arises primarily from how we perceive and value life itself, from how we perceive and treat other people, and from how we value our own existence. How we think about our own existence is critical, and not just how we think or how positively we think, but who and what we think we are. Am I, for example, more than the sum of my books, my Facebook page, or my beloved children? Am I more than the spiritual services I give at Pitt Street, just a block from here? Am I more than a body, as dear as this body is? Am I more than my mind and my feelings? Who and what I think I am radically challenges my sense of what life owes me and what I owe life, and not just what I owe my own life, but also yours. Are we 7 billion struggling, grasping, needy, frustrated, limited biological creatures living unsuccessfully alongside other species? Or is it faintly possible that we are souls on a human journey, intrinsically part of a shared universe, living a pilgrimage of discovery, metaphysically as well as socially interdependent, dependent on others for beauty and safety and love and meaning, as they are on us? Are we ready to assume that the gift of life matters, and not just for what we can do with it, but for its own sake? And not just our own life, but all those lives with which we are inevitably connected. Could it mean something if we were to pray, as we do at Pitt Street at the end of all our prayers and readings, may these words benefit us and all those whom our lives touch? I believe it does mean something to be conscious that we touch countless lives directly and indirectly through our choices and decisions, and that we can be touched and moved by all that that implies. So what about other people? What is your responsibility for their happiness or their well-being or their safety? Is it intimately linked to your own? Would you hear a call to love as a kind of fairy tale, a joke, or a guiding principle? Or as a guiding principle only when your neighbor, for example, looks and thinks and believes much as you do? These questions aren't abstract. They are urgent. Every minute of every day, we see answers to them lived out in our personal and wider worlds. In fact, beliefs don't just guide our conduct, they guide how we make sense of the world and how we impress ourselves upon it, how we shape it individually and collectively. We want happiness. We want peace. We want to live safely and appreciatively, but in my years of writing and talking and listening to you, I've really come to wonder, do we want it enough? Are we ambitious enough to glimpse what happiness, justice, and peace could allow us? We would have to give up, as a human family, our collective addiction to violence as a solution to social and personal problems. We'd have to give up some habits of dissatisfaction too, but most of all, we'd be giving up the ideologies, religious and cultural, that profit from violence and even call it just. This would include giving up the violence of poverty, as Peter Singer spoke about so eloquently, the violence of starvation, the violence of addictions and self-harm, the violence, the unspeakable violence of religious bigotry, of misogyny, homophobia, and racism, as well as the countless small and large acts of war. And perhaps even the ways that we treat ourselves harshly while we are still longing to be happy. Could we do this? Could enough of us care enough to do this? Or can I ask another question? Can we afford not to do this? For as long as we are unable to live as active, emotionally charged, purposeful peacemakers, as active caretakers of this gift of life, our knowledge of happiness will be severely limited. So much of what we call suffering is in our own hands. We may even be, wittingly or unwittingly, the cause of suffering sometimes. But the news is good, as it should be here at the Happiness Conference. For just as we can cause or prolong suffering, so we can also, and quite wonderfully, be the cause of immense happiness for ourselves and others, even and sometimes especially in the face of pain and grief and sorrow. Because happiness isn't just bliss, joy, rapture, satisfaction, engagement, delight, pleasure, fun. It's all those things sometimes. And yet, from a sacred perspective particularly, happiness more accurately describes a state of aliveness. A state of aliveness, wholeness, and even holiness that also has abundant room for compassion, for sorrow, that is courageous in the face of loss, that has the patience to be forgiving, that is supremely tender in the easing of shame and guilt. And we are right to want all that. Because as I stress so repeatedly in seeking the sacred, what we care about, we will protect. What we regard as sacred, however you interpret that, we will care also enough to protect. Caring and engaging through our caring is our well-lit, well-signposted route to happiness. For thousands of years, and never more so than in our culturally rich and diverse 21st century, we have had profound spiritual teachings available to us from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the west, telling us plainly that our personal happiness can never depend on grasping or even getting. It depends on our capacity to care, and to care well beyond our garden gate. This is summed up in part by the golden rule, that we should love our neighbors very much as we love ourselves. Of course, loving ourselves is already a challenge, but there it is in every faith and transcending every faith. Use your imagination, it urges. Cultivate your compassionate empathy, it implores. Generate the bigness of heart of which you are capable. Be kind. Be respectful. Be good-humored. Be trustworthy, and most of all, be appreciative. Do everything in such a way, said Paul to the people of Corinth, do everything in such a way that the divine, the sacred, the holy, the love of life can be expressed through it. Be kind whenever possible, said His Holiness the Dalai Lama much more recently. Be kind whenever possible, and it is always possible. Yet loving anyone but the people we need most seems to be something at which we balk. We also groan and complain with absolute justification that our vast religious institutions have failed dramatically to exemplify those sublime lessons of love. We suspect that unconditional happiness and neighborliness really is a fairy tale, even when our happiness and safety depend upon it. And I believe it does. But as critical as I am of the conduct of those institutions, I also wonder, can we expect more of them than we expect of ourselves? How lavishly are we expressing love in our own lives? How willing are we to refrain from harm? Which takes us to the silver rule: do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. Is that a bit more manageable? Again, it asks us to brush up our gifts of imagination, of empathy and compassion, because we know what we dread most. We know what we fear most for our children, and surely that knowledge could curtail our power to harm. And yet we live in a world in which happiness is not equated with generosity and peacemaking, and we need to change that. This doesn't mean leaving the wisdom of the religions behind. It doesn't mean leaving the traditions behind if they speak to you. But perhaps it does mean avoiding the tribal, avoiding the divisive, and heading straight for the unitive and transcendent. Aligning ourselves, surrendering ourselves only to those teachings that deepen our understanding of love as well as happiness. With that view, the logic of divisiveness recedes. Violence loses its power. Better still, living harmoniously and safely, even in the face of serious differences, becomes increasingly subtle and inevitable. Making peace with and within ourselves becomes possible. Looking beyond ourselves and beyond divisive labels becomes possible. In the crystal clear paradox of our time, we have never been more individualistic, yet never more conscious of what we share. In this time, our choices for change seem both poignant and compelling. I am happy before I have a reason, said Hafiz, and then he asks, what is this precious love and laughter budding in our hearts? I invite you, to experience for a moment the precious love and laughter budding in your heart. I invite you to tune your mood, your insight, your awareness to the precious love and laughter budding in your heart. I invite you to think about what would water this bud, what would nourish it, what would allow you to be much more fearless in your expression of it. I would like you to feel the fullness of it, the fullness of its potential and the fullness of its realization in small gestures of kindness, of ease with one another, of ease with yourself, of appreciation of this extraordinary gift of life that is yours. To be present to the fullness of the moment, to be present to the fullness of the breath, is to come back to the source of your happiness and of mine. To the source of your compassion and of mine. And then Hafiz, that splendid ambassador of love, asking, what is this precious love and laughter budding in our hearts, replied on our behalf, it is the glorious sound. Oh, dear ones, it is the glorious sound of our souls waking up.